Hello and welcome to the Data Engineering Podcast, the show about modern data management. When you're ready to build your next pipeline and want to test out the projects you hear about on the show, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so check out our friends over at Linode. With their managed Kubernetes platform, it's now even easier to deploy and scale your workflows, or try out the latest Helm charts from tools like Pulsar, Pachyderm, and Dagster. With simple pricing, fast networking, object storage, and worldwide data centers, you've got everything you need to run a bulletproof data platform. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/Linode today, that's Linode, and get a $100 credit to try out a Kubernetes cluster of your own. And don't forget to thank them for their continued support of this show. We've all been asked to help with an ad hoc request for data by the sales and marketing team. Then it becomes a critical report that they need updated every week or every day. Then what do? Send a CSV via email? Write some Python scripts to automate it? But what about incremental sync, API quotas, error handling, and all of the other details that eat up your time? Today, there is a better way. With Census, just write SQL or plug in your dbt models and start syncing your cloud warehouse to SaaS applications like Salesforce, Marketo, HubSpot, and many more. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/census today to get a free 14-day trial. Your host is Tobias Macy, and today I'm interviewing Blake Burch about Shipyard and his mission to create the easiest way for data teams to launch, monitor, and share resilient pipelines with less engineering. So, Blake, can you start by introducing yourself?
Hey, and thanks for having me on the podcast, Tobias. I'm Blake Burch, and I'm the co-founder of Shipyard, and I'm primarily focused on product development and marketing. Previously, I was leading up the data teams for a digital advertising agency where we were building end-to-end data workflows and automation for brands like Sephora, OpenTable, and Gap. Happy to be here.
And do you remember how you first got involved in the area of data management?
Yeah, so I had an interesting transition over time. I originally was not directly involved in the data field, and I was working directly as a marketing manager, actually building out and managing marketing campaigns. But a big passion of mine has always been automation. I was doing the same things again and again and looking at the data in the same ways and realized, how could I potentially take this data from services that we were working with and grab the information and analyze it in the same way every day? So I started doing that by learning SQL, and from that, I figured out, okay, well, I'm manually implementing things. I should probably have a way that I can directly interface with this service via like an API. And so I started teaching myself Python, and gradually all that kind of built itself as we were building out solutions for like bid management, budget management, ad creation, and whatnot for our marketing clients. I was able to build out the data team at the advertising agency, where I was really focused on trying to figure out how we could get in the right data initially, work with clients to use their proprietary data sets to better manage their marketing platforms, and ultimately try and figure out how we could drive the most value to data we have on hand. So it's been a journey so far, and now I'm at the stage where, from some of the things that I learned previously, I found some opportunities that I wanted to take advantage of in the data ecosystem to help make data teams' lives easier.
And so that brings us to what you're building at Shipyard. I'm wondering if you can give a bit more detail on the product itself and some of the story behind how it came about and what your motivations were for turning this into a business.
Yeah. So Shipyard is a data operations platform that really helps teams be able to create solutions easily without having to worry about infrastructure, monitor them without worrying about getting all that set up appropriately, and being able to share the solutions that they're building, not only with the team they're working with, but also with other employees across the company and across different departments. There were really three realizations that I had that kind of brought me on the journey to building out Shipyard. I realized that a lot of companies had this data on hand, but weren't doing anything with it besides just building out dashboards. They weren't able to easily action on it and automate that data. And it was partially because it's just really hard to get things to production. You might not have the right people with the right skills internally. You might not have data teams that have the level of interest in making sure the infrastructure is set up and maintained in a sustainable fashion. So wanted to make that as easy as possible to get any solution that was being built up and running. I also noticed from working at an agency that templates were very difficult to make and maintain and usually had a high barrier to entry. We were doing a lot of monotonous code work, which is taking the same data set for 30 different clients and loading it in the same way every single time with maybe a few slight tweaks, and managing those types of templates. There really wasn't a good solution out there to be able to effectively manage that and also to get it into the hands of non-technical users. And a final thing that I kind of noticed early on was that there's a lot of tools that are popping up across the data ecosystem, but there's no centralized spot to see the end-to-end data process and verify that everything from the initial extraction, the transformation, the loading, sending out to vendors, that all of that is running smoothly. And so about a little over a year ago, I set off with a friend of mine that worked in engineering in the previous company as well, and sat down and tried to figure out how could we build a platform that would really be able to help service these specific problems that we had seen at the agency and help other teams be able to leverage their data extremely quickly and be able to do it in a way that doesn't require as much technical and DevOps knowledge up front. So it's been a journey over the past year to get where we are today, but that's kind of our origin story and what we're trying to develop.
And so there are definitely a number of adjacent products to what you're building, and it seems like you're sort of in the Venn diagram that where a number of them overlap. I'm wondering if you can just talk through some of the evaluation of the market that you went through as you were determining what the sweet spot was for the Shipyard product itself and the specific problems that you're trying to solve that weren't addressable by some of those adjacent products.
A lot of the adjacent products that we saw were very heavily rooted in workflow as code. A lot of them were frameworks that were specific to a single language and had that barrier to entry where it was only coders that could really get involved and actively start building with them. One big thing for us was trying to make sure that the system we were building didn't require users to have any sort of proprietary configuration that had to be added to their code and mixed with the business logic. We saw that a lot of tools required that sort of addition, which meant that the code itself got convoluted and you were writing any sort of script to work for the system that you were writing it for. So we do try and make sure that if you can write and run something locally, then you can get it up and running on Shipyard without any changes and without any specific configuration files. And we also noticed from what a lot of these tools were doing is that they oftentimes required you to set up and maintain your own infrastructure. And there were headaches involved with that, where people maybe didn't have the right sort of information to make sure that things were able to dynamically scale. If you had multiple jobs running in parallel, or if you had some jobs that ran for longer periods of time or more memory intensive, they would sometimes take down the whole system. Or managing virtual environments across multiple different tasks and ensuring that package dependencies weren't causing conflicts. And these were all things that you had to focus on if you were using those orchestration frameworks. And we're trying to abstract that and make it as easy as possible to not have to really worry about those infrastructure components. And there's a lot of other aspects as we were kind of evaluating things where, because we don't have the proprietary configuration, we're actually language agnostic. So you can have a Node script that connects to a Python script, connects to a Go script, and each of them can actually share data in between each other so that you can actually build modular workflows without having to upload data to one external cloud location, download it back down, and adding all that extra stuff to your code. So when we were looking at a lot of these orchestration tools, each of them is made because someone thought there was a way to do it better. We wanted to look at all of them and figure out, okay, how can we take the good bits and streamline this process to get things up and running in a workflow for data teams?
As you were describing the initial problem that you were trying to address as well, some of the other products that come to mind, particularly focused on like the advertising and marketing capabilities, are things like Zapier or IFTTT, or some of these low-code or no-code platforms like Airtable. And I'm wondering what you saw as some of the lessons to be learned from those products that you wanted to incorporate into Shipyard to make it addressable by those teams, and some of the shortcomings that you saw to help you overcome the challenges that teams might be running up against as they're trying to deal with more data-intensive workloads.
So it's funny that you mention those, because in some instances we have been compared to like a Zapier for data. And oftentimes the low-code tools are very focused on if this, then that type rules. If one thing happens in a specific location, update a record in a existing data platform. But they oftentimes don't handle large-scale data sets. And I've used these platforms and they're great for building out a lot of different types of solutions. But oftentimes there comes a point where you can't quite build what you were trying to do, and it's not possible through the platform. And in those cases, and it exists for every tool, you have to write some sort of gap solution, some script that handles like a middle ground that you needed to accomplish, and that has to live somewhere. And at that point, you've got a tool that's running some of these workflows, and then a separate process that's acting as like an intermediary. The way that we built Shipyard initially was that you are able to take any sort of custom code that you have written and get that automated on its own. But we're providing templates up front that can get maybe 80 to 90% of the work done. So if you need to download data from BigQuery and you need to upload it to S3 or something like that, we can handle that immediately out of the gate without you having to write code. But maybe you need to do like a custom transformation layer in the center that's specific for your business, because we built out with the idea of running code on your own and templatizing that code for reusability. You're able to actually host that sort of gap script within the same interface that you're actually building out the end data solution.
Yeah, it's definitely always the biggest problem with any managed platform where, as you said, you get to 80 or 90% of the way to what you want, and then you can see everything in one UI, and then all of a sudden you now have to go to 2 different places because you had to write your own custom solution, or you have to go to 5 different places because you have to wire things together across different systems, and sort of the cognitive complexity starts to explode and your brain starts to leak out of your ears trying to keep track of it all.
Yeah, that's definitely the case, and something that we heard from a lot of folks when we were initially kind of scoping out the problem. So,
in terms of the actual main goals for Shipyard, I'm wondering if you can just talk through how you think about sort of the primary focus of it and who your target users are, both in terms of the consumers of the platform, but also the kind of maintainers or developer interface for building out these workflows.
So we are primarily targeted towards data engineers, analytics engineers, and data scientists that already know how to write some code, but frankly are in kind of a position where they may be strapped for time and resources to get things done, and ultimately a lot is falling on them within the company to try and build out solutions as the scope of data is vastly increasing over the course of the past few years. And so when we think about reaching those individuals, there's really like 3 main goals that we're focused on. The first thing is that we feel like those individuals shouldn't have to ever think about infrastructure again. You see the rise of like cloud databases like BigQuery and Snowflake that make it really easy to run hundreds of queries at the same time and scale up effectively, where you're no longer having to worry about, am I overloading the database with too many requests? We think the same thing should be done for the actual data orchestration and processing side of things, where if you need to move data from one location to another, build out alerts, deploy machine learning models, that should just automatically scale as you need it to, and so that you can focus on just building out the solution and making sure that it solves the problem that you need to. I've talked to a lot of people that are in those types of roles, and a lot of them may not have the exact DevOps skills required for the infrastructure, but a majority aren't really interested in managing it. They just have to because it's part of the job, and because there's not a system out there right now that helps them kind of abstract that. A second thing for me that's a big goal for the company is trying to make sure that you can drive action off of your data and really drive value with that data at record speeds. For us, that means making sure that our processing power is extremely fast, but it also means that we have to make the UI something that's seamless, easy to understand, easy to set up, and something where, again, you can build 80 to 90% of that solution in a matter of minutes or days rather than taking weeks to months to test and iterate and get something up and running. And a final thing that's a big goal for us at Shipyard is making sure that when we're showing these end-to-end data operations lifecycles and showing every process that is actively running, that we make it really easy to know when, where, and how something actually broke. Because inevitably, things will go wrong, but a lot of the existing systems just dump all that data directly into a single log file that you have to go through and parse. You might not know what specific process broke that caused all of these downstream issues. And we think that if you can have all of this within a more visual interface, it'll be easier for not only the data people, but business leaders to be able to tell, here's all the steps that our data is going through, to have the level of confidence to say that, oh, it broke in this spot, which affects all of these downstream processes. I can make sure that someone on the data engineering team knows what to look into, ensure that this gets resolved, and we can send out emails to customers or clients and let them know what the issues are. So those three areas are things that we're really trying to address with Shipyard.
Another interesting element that you touched on there is the exposure of Shipyard as a platform that the business leadership is going to interact with versus being a tool or a dashboard that the data engineering or the data analyst team is responsible for, who then has to translate to the other levels of the business. And I'm wondering if you can just talk through your thoughts on the role of data orchestration within an organization and how the formulation of the tool influences the ways that it's being used and the opportunities that it can provide to the business.
I think a lot of people consider the data orchestration within a business to just be around the data team's initiatives. And I really find that a lot of data is ultimately used to drive some sort of business decisions. And that data orchestration should really be the focus of taking that data and helping these different teams, whether it be finance or HR or marketing, make decisions with quality data that has been automated throughout the entire life cycle. It's not just about trying to get data clean and in a good state where other teams can use it. It's about taking it to the next step and making sure that when you have created larger data sets that the entire organization can access and use, that you're able to track how it's being accessed and used, what value it's providing, which teams are actually using it, and to make sure that when you're making updates to upstream processes that could affect the data, these are all the downstream processes and teams that are going to be affected as part of that. I think oftentimes teams might look at things in a very narrow scope, but I think there's a big opportunity to think about how can the data be used beyond just getting it into a good, clean spot for the organization? How can you actually take those decisions and automate them and know how everything is interconnected?
Digging a bit more into the Shipyard platform itself, I'm wondering if you can just talk through some of the architectural aspects of how you've designed it, how it's implemented, and how your particular focus on who the end users are has influenced the ways that you think about building the system.
From a high level, we are fully hosted on AWS infrastructure. Whenever you are running code directly in the platform, whether that's through code that you directly provide or through the blueprint templates that we provide, everything is being run in Docker containers in isolation. Whenever those Docker containers run, they're actively installing any of the package dependencies to make sure that there's no conflicts between different tasks that are running. All of the tasks that are actively running are being orchestrated across different ECS clusters. And a unique aspect of something that we do is that even though we might have the tasks running across multiple different servers, if you are running a workflow, all tasks that are involved in that workflow are actually running on a shared file system so that you can immediately access data that's being generated or downloaded and start working on it. And as soon as the workflow itself is completed, we're able to wipe that completely from our system. So that's how we're actually structured in terms of the infrastructure and running things and scaling things on our side. From an actual feature development standpoint, we are shifting our focus to really try and make things as simple and as seamless to use as possible. So some good examples of that and how development has changed over time. Initially, when we built out templates or blueprints, we provided teams with the tools to take any sort of proprietary solution that they might have and turn it into something that could be reused throughout their organization. And we found initially that no one was using those blueprints initially because people weren't exactly sure where to start, or they had very common overlapping ideas that they were trying to accomplish, like being able to download data from BigQuery or upload data to Google Cloud Storage. And so we decided we would build out a library of blueprints to integrate with all the common data tools, databases, data storage that was out there. And once we had that built out, we allowed teams to be able to copy those blueprints to their organization because we figured, okay, they're going to want to make changes, customize a few things because we're not going to be able to cover every use case. But that resulted in areas where teams were running with separate copies of sort of the same code. And so whenever we had to update things, inevitably, it made it really difficult to roll out those updates across the board. So our next step was figuring out how can we have a unified system for these templates so that everyone is always using the same version and we can make updates and add inputs and change the underlying code across the board. That's just one evolution of how we've kind of had to change the scope of what we built. We wanted to have templates initially, but we started making it to where it was easier and easier to use, to where eventually we're now at a point where anyone can hop into the platform and they have 50 plus no-code templates available and ready to use for them. And we've seen similar things across building out the workflows themselves. Initially, we didn't have a visual interface for building everything out. Over time, we found that that was a little bit more difficult to deal with because existing orchestration tools oftentimes only let you update the workflows directly within code. So we started actually building out a drag and drop visual UI where you can add additional tasks to the workflow easily. You can change the conditions that it's looking for. And we're currently trying to work on rolling out an all-in-one interface where you can build out the individual components of the tasks and connect everything together as part of a workflow, all within one system.
Digging into the templating piece itself, I'm wondering if you can talk through how those templates actually manifest in terms of the user experience of them, being able to parameterize them or add any sort of wrapping tweaks that they want, but also in terms of how it's actually managed within the context of your system and how you manage the code and the deployment and rollout of those template versions.
When it comes to templates, all the templates within the platform are code-based. So you're able to essentially take any sort of command line interface that you have made and translate it into a UI that a business user or someone else on the data team themselves are able to work with. We just kind of provide that transformative layer to be able to link everything up. So within the platform itself, you're able to actually provide inputs that you want the user to fill out. And those inputs can be something where it's alphanumeric strings. It could be passwords that they need to provide. It could be a drop down of select options. And each of those different inputs that you would have a user fill out, they get air handled in the UI. So you can make sure that the right data is being provided without having to add all that to your code itself. And whenever they provide an input, that can be passed directly to your script via a argument or via environment variable, and then used directly in your code for however you need. So that's the initial process of actually setting up and managing a template. And we built out the tool to be able to look at how those templates are being used across the organization so that you can see every single place that someone is downloading data from BigQuery and verify that all of them are running the right way. And because everything is centralized around that template, if you need to make an update to that template, whether it's adding an input or whether it's updating the code, you're able to make that in one spot and have the changes proliferate to every single task that is built with that template, which makes it really easy to have a strong management philosophy and a strong ability to troubleshoot where things might be going wrong down the road. And besides the fact that you can update those templates in bulk, you can also connect any code in the platform directly to GitHub. So you can have it pull in the most recent code from a specific repository and a specific branch or tag. So Shipyard starts becoming part of your CI/CD flow, where any new updates you make to GitHub immediately show up in Shipyard, which immediately shows up across all the tasks that you've built. So it's a really easy way to make sure that you have some sort of visibility into how things are being reused throughout the organization and ensuring that nothing's going wrong. And when we built all of our no-code templates that everyone starts out with, we're actually building things in the same exact interface that everyone else can, and we open source all of the code. So for us, it's important that you have trust that whatever you're using on Shipyard, that you can see what's under the hood and how it's being operated, but you also know that we're building things out the same exact way way that you would. And our big focus is to make sure that templates are doing one specific thing very well. So it's usually just something like downloading, uploading, or running a query against a specific service and nothing else like that, because the workflows themselves allow you to mix and match and pass data between each of those and different tasks that are each doing one very specific thing, which makes it a lot easier to troubleshoot in case something's going wrong.
As far as the actual data interchange piece, I'm wondering if you can talk through how that functions on the platform layer and some of the considerations that people need to be aware of as they're dealing with passing data across those different task boundaries. Is there any particular serialization or interchange format that needs to be thought about, and, how you manage anything in terms of as you start to scale the volume of data that you're starting to pass between those different tasks?
Yeah, so there's not too many considerations that actually have to come into play because we're handling a lot of the scaling of infrastructure on our side. So in terms of working with large data files, that's something that we see a lot of our customers doing right now without any sort of issues. But the biggest thing to think about it is if you were developing scripts locally and then trying to run them one after another, if your first script was generating some sort of file on your local system, and then you went to run the second script, it would be able to see that file that had been generated. We operate in exactly that same sort of mindset, but the shared file storage is just temporary. So while the workflow is running, all of the tasks that are part of that workflow have access to the data. As soon as it's done, or if it errors out somewhere, the data is immediately wiped. And we also make it so that whenever you're running a workflow, only tasks within that workflow have access to that data. So from a security perspective, you could run the same workflow twice in parallel, and each of those workflows would not be able to see or access the other's data. And that makes sure that everything is truly running in isolation. You're not going to have any conflicts with names of files or anything else like that. But you do have to watch out, just like you would on a local file system, to make sure that you're not having two scripts writing to the same file at the same time, causing issues, or maybe overwriting one file or another. You do have to kind of be aware of the file structure system that you're creating throughout the workflow.
In terms of the actual operational challenges that you're working through, because of the fact that you're offering this platform that is intended to scale and offer multi-tenancy to your customers and something that you're offering as a service, I'm curious what you have run up against as far as some of the complexities or difficulties of building out this business and being able to actually realize the scaling promises that you're making for your customers and manage the SLAs, especially as you're dealing with, running on AWS and their SLAs and being able to be tolerant in that context.
It's definitely an interesting challenge just because we're in a situation where we don't know what the performance of something is going to be until it's run once. But at the point that it has run multiple times, we have a lot more data on it that allows us to be able to orchestrate it and place it into the right place according to how much memory, CPU, data storage, and all that it might be using. But initially, we do have limits in place to try and make sure that there's no resource hogs where you could have a rogue script that takes down the whole system like you would have locally. Those limitations that we have, though, they're not super restrictive. I will say that one of my big frustrations initially was having to work with function as a service systems that are available via cloud services where you can only run 15-minute scripts and you might not be able to get more than a gig of memory available. We know that when you're working with large quantities of data, sometimes you're going to need to have those longer runtimes. You're going to need to have more resources available. And so we are flexible about that. But the way that the platform has been structured, we're primarily scaling horizontally. So we have a lot of processing power available for teams whenever they are initially running jobs on the platform. And the longer things run, the better we're able to orchestrate it. But if there's an influx of new jobs, it might just be a slight delay in terms of how long something is taking before it gets scheduled while we're spinning up new servers, immediately orchestrating it across those and spinning down the servers on our side. And one of the unique challenges was that idea of having that shared local storage across a workflow. That's really difficult to accomplish when you might have tasks that are part of a workflow that are running across multiple different servers. And it's something that we had to overcome and Now, when it comes to like multi-tenancy and not only making sure that we're able to scale effectively for clients, but that we're able to have really secure environments for our clients, we have a very heavily tested API with security checks in place where we have your typical create, read, update, and delete permissions for almost every single level. So you can guarantee with the types of explicit permissions that are in place that nobody will be able to access things that they shouldn't be able to access.
RudderStack's smart customer data pipeline is warehouse first. It builds your customer data warehouse and your identity graph on your data warehouse with support for Snowflake, Google BigQuery, Amazon Redshift, and more. Their SDKs and plugins make event streaming easy, and their integrations with cloud applications like Salesforce and Zendesk help you go beyond event streaming. With RudderStack, you can use all of your customer data to answer more difficult questions and send those insights to your whole customer data stack. Sign up for free at dataengineeringpodcast.com/rudder today. Another interesting aspect worth digging into is you were discussing being able to optimize the resource allocation for workloads after they've been run multiple times. And I'm curious what your story is as far as being able to manage the observability and learning aspects of your system for being able to intelligently schedule those workloads to be able to optimize your resource usage and reduce costs, and how that manifests in terms of the pricing that you're able to pass along to your users.
It's definitely a work in progress and something that we're continually trying to evolve. For right now, we're mostly making sure that we have the level of information available to ourselves and that we're able to ensure that the backend systems are running effectively and not running into any sort of resource limitations. We don't actually limit the server size or anything else that jobs might be running on right now, because we know a job that could be relatively small right now could eventually be big. That's something that's always going to be the case. But we do have to try and make sure on our end, we're trying to sell the fact that if you're running with any sort of orchestration system that's open source and you're running it on your own infrastructure, you're going to be running that infrastructure 24/7, and you're probably only going to be using it about 20% of the time, and you're going to be running into some of those limitations. For us, it's important that it's easy to have a kind of pay-as-you-go model and pay for what you use, to where you're more focused on the jobs running and running effectively, and that we're handling all of the dynamic scaling and the mass concurrency without you really ever having to fret about something going down. And hopefully that works out favorably for both of us, where we're able to help you not think about any of those intricacies, and you're not having to run and manage resources all the time.
Another interesting aspect of the platform that you're building is because you're giving users the freedom to be able to write their own scripts and execute their own processes. There are a couple of aspects to that. One being dependency management for their scripts. So if you're writing a Python job and you need to be able to pull in pandas and NumPy or what have you, how you manage the installation and versioning of those requirements. And then also, because you're running arbitrary code, how you're approaching the sandboxing aspect of it to prevent people trying to break out of the environment that they're able to execute in, and just the overall security implications of running, untested arbitrary code that your users are providing.
So when users run code directly on Shipyard, we're actually spinning up a individual Docker container for every single task that's being run. And that Docker container initially just contains the language that you've selected to make sure that that's pre-installed on a version of Linux. But at runtime, we're actually installing any dependencies that you provide up front. So there's two ways to provide those sort of package dependencies. You can either provide them directly within the UI, or if your code has a requirements.txt, package.json, or any of those files, we'll automatically find it and install those packages at runtime. So that does actually mean that when your script is running, there is a little bit of additional time involved with making sure that things are set up correctly, but it does make sure that the package versions you're using are entirely accurate every single time. You're not having to worry about which virtual environment should this task specifically be run in. You're not having to worry about making sure that virtual environments mirror each other across all the different servers that you might be running your tasks on. Frankly, you're not having to write out Docker files for every single task that you want to run. We're kind of building that for you. We found that a lot of people working with data, while they might be familiar with Docker, there were very few that were actively engaged in writing Docker file scripts and actually hosting and running those themselves. And the way that we've built it, because we're installing it at runtime, also means that we should be able to support in the future running different versions of languages as well as different versions of packages simultaneously.
In terms of the use cases that you've seen people applying Shipyard for and the workflows that they've built, I'm wondering if you can just talk through some of the most interesting or innovative or unexpected ways that it's been used.
There's two that come to mind. The first one actually resulted in us kind of building out a new feature where there was a team that whenever they had to process their data, they found that it was much faster to be able to run multiple processes in parallel and split out the work across all of them rather than having one large process that was actually transforming the data. And so they were trying to find a way that they could kind of dynamically end up splitting out this job to where if a million rows came in, they wouldn't have to hard code like, hey, this particular script needs to do the first 100,000, the next one needs to do the next 100,000, and so on and so forth. They wanted to kind of be dynamic. And so we actually work with them to build out a system where the tasks that you run are contextually aware of how they're actively running within the Shipyard platform. So you can know, hey, there are 10 other vessels with the same name running at the same time, and I'm number 2 in line, so that can actually be passed to the code itself. And depending on how much data comes through, it's able to automatically split itself across all those tasks and run them in parallel, and then spit out the data for downstream tasks in the workflow. So that was a really unique case for us to help someone build out and make sure that they were able to have that sort of parallel processing that happened dynamically based on any of the data that came in. Another really big workflow that we've seen that was kind of interesting was the idea of a data engineering team that was trying to reduce the amount of tickets that they were getting internally for, hey, my data doesn't look right, can you help me? Initially, when we kind of built out the blueprints, we expected this to be pretty heavily used within the data teams themselves, but not externally. We saw this team actually build out a system where their data loading processes were actually something that they gave internal team members access to, where they could add an input and say like, hey, I need you to load data for this specific client. I need it to be between these date ranges, and I need it to be for this specific data source. And they could click run now on their own. So instead of having to address those constant streams of support tickets, they were actually able to help serve themselves with reloading that data. And I definitely felt like that was an interesting use case and kind of opened up a lot of what we're trying to shift towards to figure out how you can potentially get some of these solutions in the hands of not only data team members, but other business teams throughout the organization.
And in your own experience of building out the Shipyard platform and helping to understand and drive the product direction forward and work with your customers, I'm wondering what are the most interesting or unexpected or challenging lessons that you've learned in the process?
One of the biggest ones for me is that data orchestration is not something that a lot of organizations are actively seeking or even know that they need to be seeking out. A lot of times they're very focused on finding a specific solution for integrating or working with 2 different vendors that they might be using. And those 2 different vendors are different for every organization. Because data orchestration itself is not something that's commonly sought after, you find a lot of people that are still fully dependent on running individually scheduled cron jobs that are running all of these internal processes and scripts that people have written. You have some teams that are still relying on someone to have an open laptop that's running a script that they can't touch because it might run out of resources, because it's just not a common tool like CRM is or something like that. A business doesn't quite know that they need a data orchestration tool, but once they find a tool that's able to help them create that solution, they're able to kind of find more and more use cases for it. And I think that's been a really big challenge from a marketing perspective, trying to help teams that aren't necessarily aware of that sort of data orchestration tooling, figure out how else they can use it and what other problems it can help them solve internally beyond just the one integration of 2 vendors that they were trying to build out. And I think a secondary thing for me was Not knowing exactly how deeply rooted open source technology was within the data ecosystem initially, I'm very much someone that I look at things in terms of what's the cost of my time to build it. And if there's another service that's less than that time, I'll just go and buy it. But there's a lot of folks in the data community that are really passionate about implementing and using open source technology, which I think is a fantastic thing. But they don't always think about the time investment and the money investment of managing and operating the infrastructure itself. And so sometimes it's more of an educational piece that we have to go through to help folks understand that if you go with an open source technology, these are the uphill battles that you might face when it comes to infrastructure support and all those good things that you wouldn't have to face with a more proprietary solution. And so I'd say between those two things, those have just been kind of interesting revelations that we've seen across the way that ultimately just result in needing to have better education in this space, because being in the data space, you kind of take some of the pieces of knowledge that you might have for granted, and you don't always realize that not everyone's at the same stage, and not everyone is thinking about things in the same way, and that we're really in the early stages of figuring out how exactly do you build these end-to-end data pipelines, and we have to make sure that everyone is brought up to speed with the right information there.
Yeah, it's definitely always amazing to see how far people will go with incremental changes to address the immediate pain without realizing how much sort of technical debt they're accruing or how much additional pain they're about to run into because they've got this house of cards that's been piling up behind them just because they don't know that there is another option. And you hand that to them and they say, oh my God, this is amazing. How did I ever live without this? I'm going to go and use this for everything now.
Yeah.
In terms of people who have realized that data orchestration is an option and that they do have the opportunity for applying it to their business or within their workflows of processing data and analyzing data, what are the cases where Shipyard is the wrong choice and they might be better suited using one of these code-oriented open source frameworks or, a different managed platform that's perhaps more sort of broad-based? What are the existing shortcomings of Shipyard that might lead someone to choose a different solution for their data orchestration needs?
I would say there's 3 areas where Shipyard would be the wrong choice. The first one is if you have any sort of requirements for your business where everything needs to be maintained and run on your own infrastructure from security standpoint, because we are a managed platform, we're not able to work on someone else's existing infrastructure. And frankly, we wouldn't be able to have the level of scalability and the don't think about infrastructure component if we were able to run on your own infrastructure. Another reason why Shipyard would be the wrong choice is if you actively want a workflow as code framework. I know that there are some individuals that want to make sure that everything they have is written out in code, and that's something that we're not planning on ever really providing. We do really want to focus on the aspect of not having to have that proprietary logic embedded into your business code. That you could take a script, run it locally, run it on Shipyard, run it on any other system. And so if you're looking for a framework, we're not able to help solve that right now. And finally, if you don't have someone that actively has working knowledge of how to write scripts to create solutions, then Shipyard isn't going to be the right fit right now. We're trying to figure out how to get into a spot where if you're armed with SQL, you can create any sort of solution that you might want to, but we're currently not at that state. And like I mentioned earlier, there's that 10% gap of things that you may not be able to actually build unless you have some sort of scripting knowledge. And that's really going to be necessary for taking full advantage of what Shipyard has to offer.
One of the other things that we didn't dig into too much, but you alluded to a little bit, was the kind of versioning and CI/CD aspect of implementing your own custom scripts or blueprints, and then also what your story is for being able to integrate things like data quality checks, or somebody might want to use something like Great Expectations or tools and platforms such as Monte Carlo or Soda Data, and what the opportunities are there.
So for us, we integrate really well with tools like Great Expectations, where I actually wrote a blog post about this at one point, how the ideal state for a lot of data orchestration is to have a test after every single step and ensure that data is not changing and that it's meeting your expectations throughout the entire process. But for a lot of teams, that's not necessarily sustainable. The teams might not have enough manpower or enough time to be able to have all those tests in place. But within the Shipyard platform, you are able to add in those additional testing tasks and use the output of those tests for actually creating workflow logic. So you could have it to where if there's any sort of failed test, have the step error out, and then none of the rest of the processes end up running, so that you're effectively able to address the root cause of why your test wasn't able to pass. In terms of integrating with external data testing platforms, that's something that you can still do right now, but you wouldn't be able to actually run those direct tests directly within the platform. But I think the way that we're running testing and data quality right now mirrors the experience that a lot of data engineers are finding, where the testing is an extra step. And I think there's a big opportunity in the market and for us to figure out how the testing itself can be integrated as part of the task run, to where whenever you run the step, it is running the testing at the same time. And that resulting output can actually be used for determining if a workflow should continue on or not. And I think there's also a big opportunity when it comes to testing to not only test the data itself and make sure that it looks right, but to look at the metadata of your data and of your execution process and verify, are the runtimes looking consistent? Is it always starting at the right amount of time? Is it using generally the same amount of memory or storage space? And to look at those sort of details to ultimately try and determine if there could potentially be something wrong in your pipeline. I think when it comes to testing right now, it's an extra step, and the goal is to try and get it into something that's a little bit more integrated and something that can be a little bit more context aware and provide some of those proactive insights that something might be wrong with your data or with your process as a whole.
As you continue to build out the platform and the business of Shipyard, what are some of the things that you have planned for the near to medium term, or problems that you're particularly excited to try and tackle?
So one of them is definitely the aspect of having that integrated testing and having smarter logs and alerting for anything that could change within the execution environment. We think as we're kind of building out a system that is integrating all of these different data tools, that there's a large opportunity to verify and monitor how the execution of all of those tools is running and make sure that that's consistent. We're also really excited about scoping out data snapshots for any of the workflows that you run. Currently, we do delete data as soon as something has finished running, but we think there's a big opportunity for being able to kind of keep it in a holding pattern if something goes wrong, so you don't have to start things back from the beginning. If something does go wrong, you're able to fix the issue and have it start over from midway within a workflow. And then other things for us are just increasing the simplicity and speed of getting things up and running. So from a developer experience side of things, it means having some sort of command line interface or an API where the teams can actually build out these workflows and tasks in bulk rather than having to go into the UI themselves. And within the UI, we're trying to make sure that we have a all-in-one interface where you can build out the tasks and the workflow all in one spot, rather than having to kind of build out the framework in your head first, build out the task, then connect the tasks together as part of a workflow. So those are all areas that we're excited about implementing and scoping further over the course of the next year.
Are there any other aspects of the work that you're doing at Shipyard, or the ways that it's being used, or just the overall space of data orchestration and its role within the business that we didn't discuss yet that you'd like to cover before we close out the show?
I think for me, one thing that I'm interested to see what happens over the course of the next 5 years is what happens with all of these different types of data tools that are popping up to ultimately impact a specific sliver of the data operations lifecycle. I think there's a big opportunity for some sort of tool to ultimately integrate all of these tools together and provide that level of visibility of the end-to-end workflow. And that's something that I'm super excited about. And that's ultimately why I'm here building Shipyard, trying to make it easy for someone to deploy those solutions and connect things together without worrying about infrastructure. But I think there's going to be a real hurt in the future as more and more of these tools come out, where we find a lot of fragmentation and segmentation that ultimately needs to be kind of mended back together in order to make sure that the process that you have that's touching your data is running smoothly.
Well, for anybody who wants to get in touch with you and follow along with the work that you're doing, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And as a final question, I'd like to get your perspective on what you see as being the biggest gap in the tooling or technology that's available for data management today.
Beyond the integration of multiple tools, I think being able to test data in an effective way without it being so much of a hands-on approach is definitely one of the biggest problems to be solved within the data environment. A lot of times teams are building off of trust rather than based off of knowledge that things look exactly like they should look. But it is a very arduous task to test for every single piece of data and for every single step as part of the process. I think the more that we can really innovate in the space of trying to look at all of the metadata available to us, the more that it will be easy to potentially provide some sort of anomaly detection or proactive alerting for the potential of something being wrong in the data rather than requiring teams to build out all those tests up front. Because there's nothing worse than having bad data that you're ultimately trying to build up trust within the organization again. And the more that we can have better tooling that helps make sure those flaws aren't making their way to production and making their way into the hands of other people in the organization, the better off data teams are going to be and the more value they're actually going to be able to provide for their organization.
All right. Well, thank you very much for taking the time today to join me and share the work that you're doing at Shipyard and your background and context on how the overall data orchestration problem space can be more beneficial and more accessible to the business. So I appreciate all the time and energy you've put into building Shipyard and helping to drive the overall ecosystem forward. So thank you again for your time and effort on that. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks. You too. Appreciate it.
Listening. Don't forget to check out our other show, podcast.init, at pythonpodcast.com to learn about the Python language, its community, and the innovative ways it is being used. And visit the site at dataengineeringpodcast.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, and read the show notes. If you've learned something or tried out a project from the show, then tell us about it. Email hosts at dataengineeringpodcast.com with your story. And to help other people find the show, please leave a review on iTunes and tell your friends and coworkers.